Let me be direct with you from the very beginning, because anything softer would only dilute what actually matters. And you don't need dilution. You need clarity that cuts through the noise you've been living in. Because the truth is, the path to your first $100,000 is not hidden. It is not complex. It is not reserved for the unusually talented. It is simply resisted, avoided, and misunderstood by almost everyone who attempts it. And that misunderstanding is not intellectual. It is behavioral. It is psychological. It is rooted in the gap between what people know and what they are willing to consistently do over long periods of time without external validation. Because if building wealth were about knowledge, almost everyone with access to information would already be financially independent, and yet they are not. And that alone should tell you that the constraint is not information, but execution, not ideas, but identity, not strategy, but alignment between intention and action. And once you begin to see this clearly, you realize that the real bottleneck is not outside of you. It is within you, embedded in your habits, your impulses, your reactions, and your default ways of interpreting the world. And these defaults are rarely designed for long-term outcomes. They are designed for short-term comfort, for immediate relief, for social approval, and those forces are constantly pulling you away from the behaviors that actually build wealth. Because wealth in its most fundamental form is not built through intensity, it is built through consistency. And consistency is boring, it is repetitive, it is invisible, and it does not reward you immediately, which is exactly why most people fail to maintain it, not because they are incapable, but because they are unwilling to tolerate the emotional discomfort of delayed gratification. And that discomfort is the price. It is the barrier. It is the filter that separates those who accumulate from those who oscillate between progress and regression without ever stabilizing into growth. The individuals who reach their first $100,000 from ordinary starting points are not operating on superior intelligence. They are operating on a different internal framework, one that prioritizes rational decision-making over emotional impulses, one that values long-term positioning over short-term stimulation, and one that understands that repetition, when aligned correctly, becomes a force multiplier over time. And that understanding changes how you behave on a daily basis, because instead of asking what feels good right now, you begin to ask what compounds over time. And that shift, while subtle, is profound, because it removes you from the reactive mode that most people live in and places you into a deliberate mode where your actions are chosen, not triggered. And this is where control begins, because without control over your behavior, you cannot control your outcomes. And without control over your outcomes, you remain dependent on external circumstances. And dependence is the opposite of wealth, because wealth is not just money. Wealth is autonomy. It is the ability to make decisions independent of immediate necessity. And that ability is built gradually, through a system, not through moments of motivation, not through bursts of discipline, but through a structure that holds even when your emotions fluctuate, because your emotions will fluctuate. Your environment will change, your energy will vary, and if your system depends on stability in those variables, it will collapse. So the system must be robust. It must operate under imperfect conditions. It must be simple enough to repeat and strong enough to endure, and simplicity is often misunderstood as lack of sophistication, when in reality it is a requirement for consistency, because complex systems break under pressure, while simple systems persist. And persistence is what generates results. When you reduce the process of building your first $100,000 to its core components, you realize that there are only a few variables that actually matter: your savings rate, your income trajectory, and your time horizon. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is noise. And most people spend their time optimizing noise because it feels productive without requiring meaningful sacrifice. They focus on small efficiencies while ignoring the larger behaviors that truly move the needle. And this is a form of avoidance. It is a way to stay busy without confronting the real constraints. Because increasing your savings rate requires you to say no to things that are socially normalized. It requires you to separate yourself from patterns of consumption that are reinforced by your environment. It requires you to tolerate being different. And that creates friction, not just practical friction, but psychological and social friction. And most people are not prepared to handle that, so they default back to what is comfortable, what is familiar, what is validated by those around them. And in doing so, they sacrifice long-term outcomes for short-term alignment, and that trade-off is rarely conscious. It happens gradually, through small decisions that seem insignificant in isolation, but compound over time into a pattern that defines your trajectory. This is where awareness becomes critical, because without awareness, you cannot see the pattern, and if you cannot see the pattern, you cannot change it, and most people never develop that level of awareness because it requires honesty. It requires observing your own behavior without justification, without narrative, without the need to protect your ego. And that is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the reality that many of your outcomes are self-generated, not externally imposed. And while that realization removes the comfort of blame, it gives you something far more valuable. It gives you leverage. Because once you accept that your behavior is the primary driver of your results, you gain the ability to modify it. And that ability is where progress begins, because without it, you are simply reacting. And reaction does not lead to accumulation. It leads to survival, and survival is a loop. It is a cycle that keeps you engaged but not advancing, active but not progressing. And breaking out of that loop requires intentional deviation from your defaults. It requires you to act in ways that feel unnatural at first, because they go against your conditioning. And that is why discipline is required, not as a permanent state, but as a transitional force that allows you to override your impulses long enough to establish new patterns. And once those patterns are established, they become your new defaults, reducing the need for constant effort. The idea of reaching $100,000 in a year or over any defined period is often misunderstood because people fixate on the number rather than the process. They see the outcome as something extraordinary, something that requires a breakthrough, when in reality, it is the result of ordinary actions performed consistently without interruption. And that is where the real difficulty lies, not in complexity, but in persistence. Because persistence without immediate reward feels unnatural. It feels like effort without feedback, and your brain is not designed to sustain that easily. It seeks signals, it seeks validation, it seeks confirmation that what you are doing is working. But wealth does not provide that early. It withholds it. It requires you to continue operating based on logic rather than emotion, to trust a process before it becomes visible. And this is where most people stop, not because the process is flawed, but because their tolerance for delayed results is low. And that low tolerance is a function of conditioning, of living in environments where feedback is immediate, where gratification is instant. And breaking that conditioning is necessary if you want to operate on a longer time horizon, because wealth is built on delayed curves, where the early phase appears insignificant and the later phase accelerates. And if you cannot sustain effort during the early phase, you will never reach the point where the curve turns in your favor. This is also why identity matters more than strategy, because strategies can be learned quickly, but identities are built slowly, and your identity determines your behavior when no one is watching, when there is no pressure, when there is no immediate consequence. And those moments are where your trajectory is actually shaped, not in dramatic decisions, but in quiet ones, repeated daily. And if your identity is aligned with long-term accumulation, those decisions become automatic. They no longer require negotiation. They no longer feel like sacrifice. They become part of who you are. And that is the real objective. Not just to reach a financial milestone, but to become the type of person for whom that milestone is a natural byproduct. Because once that identity is established, the process sustains itself. It becomes self-reinforcing, reducing friction and increasing consistency. And consistency is what compounds, not intensity, not occasional bursts of effort, but steady, predictable action over time. At a practical level, this translates into a few fundamental behaviors that must be stabilized before anything else. Controlling your expenses, increasing your income, and maintaining a gap between the two. And that gap is your engine. It is the mechanism through which you convert effort into accumulation. And protecting that gap is essential because it is constantly under threat from both internal impulses and external influences. Internally, you are driven by the desire for comfort, for reward, for relief, and externally, you are influenced by social norms, by marketing, by the behavior of those around you, all of which encourage consumption, not accumulation. And resisting those forces requires clarity, because without clarity, you will rationalize deviations, you will justify small expenses, you will blur the line between needs and wants, and over time, those small deviations erode your progress, not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that are easy to ignore until the cumulative effect becomes visible. Increasing your income, on the other hand, requires a different kind of effort. It requires leverage, because there is a limit to how much you can save, but there is less of a limit to how much you can earn. And that means you need to move beyond linear models of income, where your earnings are directly tied to your time, because time is finite, and if your income is capped by your hours, your growth will be constrained. So you need to develop skills that allow you to create value beyond your immediate labor, skills that can scale, whether through technology, through media, through systems, or through ownership. And this does not happen immediately. It requires learning, experimentation, and iteration. But it is essential if you want to accelerate your trajectory, because without leverage, you are relying solely on discipline. And while discipline can take you far, leverage amplifies your efforts, allowing you to achieve more with the same input. And that amplification is what shortens timelines. Time horizon is the third variable, and it is often the least understood, because most people operate on short timelines, expecting results quickly, evaluating progress frequently, and making adjustments based on incomplete data. And this leads to inconsistency, to starting and stopping, to abandoning processes before they have time to work, and extending your time horizon changes how you interpret your progress. It allows you to remain stable during periods where results are not visible. It reduces the emotional impact of short-term fluctuations, and it aligns your expectations with the reality of how compounding works. Because compounding is not linear, it is exponential, and exponential processes are deceptive. They appear slow until they are not. And if you do not understand that, you will exit before the inflection point, before the moment where your past consistency begins to produce visible results. Ultimately, the path to your first $100,000 is not about discovering something new. It is about executing something simple with a level of consistency that most people are unwilling to maintain. It is about aligning your behavior with your long-term goals in a way that becomes automatic, reducing reliance on motivation and increasing reliance on structure. It is about building systems that operate even when you do not feel like operating. And that is what creates stability. And stability is what allows growth to occur, because without stability, your efforts are scattered, inconsistent, and inefficient. And with stability, they become focused, predictable, and compounding. And once that compounding begins, everything changes, not suddenly but gradually, in a way that becomes undeniable over time. And at that point, what once felt difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes routine, and what once seemed distant becomes inevitable. Not because of luck, not because of timing, but because of sustained alignment between your actions and your objectives, repeated long enough to matter.